Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Disaster Recovery 101 webinar, part of our training institute for tenants and residents. I want to start by officially welcoming you to the second trimester of the Training Institute for tenants and residents. Whether you've been with us from the beginning or this is your first time joining, we're excited to have you in community with us. As you come in, again, go ahead and drop your name, city, state, and organization in the chat. We love to know where everyone's tuning in from. My name is D. Ross. I'm the Tenant Leader Fellow. I oversee and manage the Training Institute for Tenants and Residents. And today we will be presenting Disaster Recovery 101, led by Noah, Director of Disaster Recovery, and Meghan, uh, Disaster Housing Recovery Specialist. And then I'll also be talking about the next steps and upcoming webinars that's coming up after this course. So now, before we begin, I will want to share a little bit about the Training Institute for Tenants and Residents, especially for the ones that are new today. I just want to remind the previous attendees, this initiative is a national effort rooted in education, empowerment, and organizing. Our mission is to build the leadership and capacity of renters and tenant leaders across the country, especially those most impacted by housing injustices. Through workshops like today's, along with our growing network of tools, resources, and community spaces, we're helping tenant leaders, residential leaders like you become informed, organized, and prepared to advocate for real change. Whether it's disaster recovery, tenant organizing, or housing policy, we're committed to equipping you with the tools you need to raise your voice and uplift your community. So with that, let's dive into today's topic. Noah, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Dee. And hello, everybody. So, welcome to Disasters 101, um, tentatively titled Disaster Systems Organizing and Advocacy. My name is Noah Patton, Director of Disaster Recovery here at the Coalition, joined by my partner in crime, Meghan Mertyris, also on our disaster team. I'll say just to start out, fair warning, both me and Megan are sick this week. So this is going to be a bit zanier than usual, but we are very, very happy to be here with all of you talking about this important issue. Uh, and so, yeah, I'll just take the first slide, the next slide. Yeah, so I did want to talk a little bit about what NLIHC is doing in the disaster space. So NLIHC kind of started doing disaster response and recovery stuff immediately after Hurricane Katrina, which had a sad anniversary earlier this year. And then we really began looking into this space in earnest in 2017 after Hurricanes Maria and then Hurricane Harvey in Puerto Rico and in Houston. So we started off just by creating kind of this hurricane working group just to look at those two hurricanes. And then we had really bad wildfires that year. So then it was the hurricanes and wildfire working group. And then we had really bad tornadoes that year. And then so it was and so on and so forth. So we've been adding disasters and locations as we go. So we've created this Disaster Housing Recovery Coalition, or the DHRC. So it's grown up to a group of over 900 local, state, and national groups working to ensure that all disaster survivors receive the assistance that they need to fully recover, with a specific focus around households with lower incomes, individuals living with disabilities, individuals from Black and Brown, as well as Indigenous communities, and making sure that our country's broken disaster recovery system, which we'll get into, can meet their needs. And so we do a lot, across the country around disasters. We do federal advocacy. So we have this nationwide network. And so when we see bad things happening in, Florida as well as California, we integrate that in to our work at the Hill. And what I, like to say, when we're yelling at FEMA. And then we're also making sure that people on the ground are talking between those areas. So they're sharing information, sharing what's working, what might not be working. Me and Megan also have a lot of experience in disasters, so we can help groups when they're working through a disaster on the ground, and then also kind of help groups kind of navigate a disaster in terms of like, hey, who should I be talking to get this type of assistance? Like, do you guys have examples of letters or, things to assist? Um, so happy to do all of those things. And for now, I think I'm going to turn it over to Megan to get us going, and then I'll come around as the cleanup hitter at the end. So I'll just pass it right over to Megan.
Cool. We can take the next slide. Yeah, so first of all, hi everybody. My name is Meghan Mertyris, and I'm a disaster housing recovery analyst here at the National Low Income Housing Coalition. So before we jump into the main reason Noah and I are here today, I very briefly just wanted to share my own story to introduce myself, but also to ground us in why the things that we're going to be talking about today aren't just good policies and laws, but truly have people's lives at stake. So the first picture I have up here is Manville, New Jersey. And this area is largely considered to be ground zero for Hurricane Ida in New Jersey. Um, I live about 15 minutes from where this picture was taken. So Hurricane Ida hit New Jersey in 2021, garnering federal disaster grants in over half of all of New Jersey's counties and killing 30 people who ranged in age from 18 to 83. And my family and I lived in one of those counties, and so many of the communities I grew up in were deeply impacted. And what my family most vividly recalls from the night Hurricane Ida hit New Jersey was the sound of water literally rushing into the sides of our house. And to make a long story short, I ended up getting connected with an amazing organizing group of Superstorm Sandy survivors who were actually getting drawn into Hurricane Ida recovery. And they asked me if I would lead their IDA campaign. So I worked as a community organizer in New Jersey, where I built, organized, and mobilized a base of more than 1,000 people impacted by Hurricane Ida from across the state to advocate for the passage of legislative and administrative solutions to fix our broken disaster recovery system. And that second picture is me giving a presentation on disaster recovery grants in Somerville, which is another community I spent my life growing up in and was devastated by the storms. So first, I really want to hear from all of you, and I know this is gonna be kind of more difficult because we're gonna be using the chat, but I shared a little bit about my story, and I'm wondering if folks also have experiences with disasters. So have any of you also had experience with disasters? If you did, kind of what did that look like for you? And I know we may have a little bit of a delay with the chat. Um, but would love to hear from folks their experience with disasters. And I'll read some of those out as they come in. So, yeah, Katrina says 7 wildfires. Tayana says the 2008 financial crisis and being displaced. Samantha says we have forest fires in our states. Would love to hear from others as well. Yeah, July 4th flooding, wildfires in Oregon. Yeah, Tropical Storm Chantel. Um, Leela witnessed a lot of people being displaced and facing homelessness. Hurricane Katrina. Glenn says numerous hurricanes. Yeah, so on and so forth. California wildfires. Superstorm Sandy. Yeah, Lori, I'm very familiar as well. We experienced lots of flooding in Florida. Sandy in New York, really scary. Yeah. And thank you. Thank you so much for those of you who are sharing in the chat. And please feel free to continue to do so and kind of share what those experiences looked like for you. But unfortunately, as expected, a lot of us are no strangers to disaster. Um, but with that being said, I do want to make sure we all have some of the same baseline info on like what a disaster is, how recovery works, at least how it's supposed to work, and why our recovery system is so broken. And a quick note that if you have questions or an experience that relates to what I'm talking about, please feel free to go ahead and pop it in the chat. And we'll also have some built-in question breaks as time allows. So don't worry, we'll definitely have more time to get into all of this that you guys are sharing. So next slide. So to kick us off, what is a disaster? So the way a disaster is defined can vary because disasters are political in nature. So a disaster can happen and not officially be called that, or on the other hand, something can be called a disaster but not actually be one. So think the current administration's rhetoric around immigration and what a disaster all that is. That being said, generally in the emergency management world, a disaster is defined as when a hazard, be it wind, rain, Godzilla, meets the built environment, which is the places we live, work, and go about our lives, and causes conditions that overwhelm the ability to effectively withstand and respond to that disaster while continuing to function. And then you also have the way the federal government designates a disaster. So the federal government will issue a presidentially declared disaster when a state, territory, or tribe's ability to respond is overwhelmed and that place has reached a certain threshold of damage. So, of course, this is also political. And lately, we've been seeing a huge increase in the amount of time it's taking the federal government to actually make these declarations. And obviously, this is a major problem because getting a disaster designated as a presidentially declared disaster is what triggers all the recovery programs to start. So states don't really have like substantial recovery programs. It all comes from the federal government. And we're going to talk more about that in a moment. And finally, we don't use the term natural disaster. And that's because the way disasters happen in our country are not natural, as we'll also get into in a moment. For instance, it's not natural that families with low incomes are hit the hardest by disasters. That happens because politicians chose to enact racist and classist policies that located low income housing in more disaster prone areas. And additionally, the term natural disasters kind of automatically implies that there's nothing that can be done to lessen the impacts of disasters, and that our elected and administrative officials don't have a responsibility to help communities recover and be better prepared for the next disaster, when obviously that could not be further from the truth. Next slide. So, as folks in the chat were just saying from their own experiences, disasters impact our ability to live. So, when I was organizing and continue to be organizing through the DHRC, we would kind of refer to this as the storm after the storm or the disaster after the disaster, aka the long lasting financial, emotional, and health impacts of a system that leaves many of our families to fall through the cracks. And this can look like physical harm, monetary harm, displacement, as a lot of folks were just talking about, impacts to our benefits, amongst a variety of other things that leave us to fall through the cracks and make it harder for us to live our lives and get our families the things that we need to be safe and to thrive. So if we could go to the next slide. I want to be clear that this system works for no one except those who already have large amounts of their own private savings. But obviously, it hits those with low incomes and from the most marginalized groups worst and first. So when disasters strike the lowest income survivors, including people of color, seniors, people with disabilities, people experiencing homelessness, people with limited English proficiency, etc., are often the hardest hit, but have the fewest resources to recover and face the longest, steepest path to get home and whole. And despite this clear need, federal efforts frequently leave these survivors without the assistance they need to get back on their feet, and their communities less resilient to future disasters. And the result is a broken disaster recovery system that exacerbates and reinforces racial, income, and accessibility inequities at each stage of our response and recovery. And again, let's be clear, things do not have to be this way. This is a choice those in powers have made, and it's disheartening to say the least, but it also means a different way forward is possible, as we'll talk about in a minute. Next slide. So, to go back to just understanding how the system is supposed to work and then kind of where some of those cracks are. After disaster, there are 5 main forms of help folks rely on if they get a presidentially declared disaster. You have the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA assistance, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, or HUD assistance, other government programs, nonprofit assistance, and insurance and private funds. So today we're going to focus on the first 4, as obviously at NLIHC we focus on those with the lowest income, and they usually don't have access to large amounts of insurance or private funds. So if we could go to the next slide, the first recovery program many survivors are going to come in contact with is FEMA. And there are a ton of sub-programs meant to address the different needs survivors are going to have during their short-term recovery, like temporary housing, basic repairs to make their house livable again, rental assistance, and many more, as you can see from the image on the screen. But it's all basically meant to address people's short-term recovery needs. If we could go to the next slide, this sounds great, but in practice, FEMA assistance, as anyone who's interacted with FEMA knows well, is extremely difficult to access. And usually the aid disaster survivors can get is far from the amount they need to get home and whole. So as just one example of why it's so hard to access FEMA assistance, it's extremely likely that the first time a survivor applies for assistance, they'll get something called a denial letter. And despite its misleading name, denial letters are not actual denials. It usually just means the survivor needs to appeal their case and most likely clarify some of the information they provided on the first application. But because of the misleading messaging around the denial process and the fact that most people need a lawyer to actually understand the process overall, disaster survivors with low incomes and from marginalized groups are significantly less likely to appeal their FEMA denial, making it all the more difficult to access the assistance they need. Um, Things were so bad that when I was organizing, we used to tell people to treat FEMA like a toddler trying to put on its own pants. So they're not likely to get things right the first time or even the second time. And yes, while it would be great if it were that easy and simple, it likely will not be. So we told people they just need to be ready to try and try again. And as we're going to see throughout this presentation and talk about more, this system is really set up to get people to give up. And so we did a lot of organizing advocacy and continue to do that around folks just keep trying to get the assistance that they not only need, but are also entitled to. And then if we could go to the next slide. On the long-term recovery side of things, you have HUD's long-term recovery program. So 18 months after a disaster, when FEMA has to, by law, transition out of a disaster-impacted area, HUD's long-term recovery program takes over. And this is the only long-term recovery funding available from the federal government, and it's meant to address the unmet needs of disaster survivors that might not have been met through other federal programs or funding sources. So funds can be used for housing, infrastructure, and economic development, and are administered by states. And they can actually be used to do a lot of great things. It's a really good program. And also 70% of all of this money has to benefit low to moderate income households, which we love. So next slide, please. The only problem with this program is that it doesn't permanently exist. So, as those of you who lived it know, a recovery is far from done 18 months after a disaster. And hypothetically, this is where HUD's long-term recovery program comes into play. but the grant program isn't permanently authorized, meaning it's not a permanent program. So what we see in practice is every so often, at no really regular or consistent time, our Congress has to come together and pass off these one term like disaster aid packages in an effort to haphazardly attempt to get recovery money to families who need it the most. But this is obviously hard to do in practice. Because the program isn't permanent, we end up with an extremely lengthy process that results in critical aid not reaching those who need it the most in a timely manner. Because the program isn't permanent, requirements for it are constantly changing because HUD has to rewrite the program's regulations every time. There's little oversight regarding how states use the money to ensure that it's actually going to disaster survivors. The needs of renters and individuals experiencing homelessness could be underestimated, and smaller states don't always have the capacity to actually administer these grants. And then we could go to the next slide. You have other types of government and nonprofit assistance. So there's programs like HUD's Rapid Unsheltered Survivor Housing Program or the RUSH program. So this is a program that's meant to help communities provide outreach, emergency shelter, rapid rehousing, and other assistance to people experiencing or at risk of homelessness in disaster-affected areas, but who are unable to access services provided by FEMA. So FEMA will not provide assistance to folks who were experiencing homelessness prior to the disaster happening. And they claim that this is because the person's need for housing was not caused by the disaster. Obviously, you could guess why this is really problematic. You also have programs like Disaster SNAP or DSNAP and Disaster Unemployment Assistance. Disaster Unemployment Assistance gives benefits to folks who either lost their job or their job was interrupted because of the disaster. And then there's also nonprofit assistance. So organizations can do things like provide non-cash and cash direct assistance, legal services, community organizing opportunities, counseling and support, among many other things. And then if we could go to the next slide. But as I'm sure you are beginning to put together by now, there are really systemic barriers that makes accessing these programs really difficult. Other government assistance is a drop in the bucket compared to what the actual needs of disaster survivors are. And again, like I said, that's if you can actually access the assistance. And although nonprofit groups do literally life saving, my apologies, and life-changing work, and they're there when the system fails, both addressing needs and organizing for systemic solution. Despite that, since our disaster recovery system is so broken, these community-based organizations are the real first responders, but are never really treated as such by those in power, which leaves another huge gap. So with that, I think the next slide is going to be questions. And I don't know if anyone has dropped any questions in the chat. Um, but as I go through, I will pass things on to Noah.
Sounds good. Sorry about that. My screen froze for a hot second. But yeah, I'll take the next slide then. Megan, you can work on any questions in the chat. Cool. So this is just a reminder that so all of these issues, again, are systemic. So they're happening across the country. These issues are baked into the fabric of how this country does disaster response and recovery. And so I will take the next slide then. So changing that can seem exceptionally impossible. But of course, that is kind of the nature of the issue, right? In that we're trying to, the system is trying to teach us that things are impossible. It's impossible to change. So we should just, kind of work through a broken system and try as hard as we can to figure out, how to get the assistance that we, uh, are eligible for after a disaster. So, you know, that's not impossible. Fixing the system is not impossible. What is impossible is like unicorns, lassoing the moon, and what looks like a mermaid and a large seahorse going out on a date together. Those things would be impossible. So I will take the next slide. And kind of in our work so far, um, I've learned that everything is impossible until it becomes possible. And so we have accomplished a lot of impossible things so far in the years that the Disaster Housing Recovery Coalition has been working. I won't read through all of these, but we have, you know, prompted significant reforms at FEMA for increasing access to assistance. HUD created the Rush program largely because we were pushing for greater assistance to folks experiencing homelessness during a disaster. There was a lot of COVID hotel room sheltering during the COVID-19 pandemic that was largely due to all of our advocacy together in pushing for these things, all of which would have been impossible until they became possible. So it's just always good to start off any conversation around systemic change with a gut check about, what is possible after all. I will take the next slide. Yeah, so really um, at this point, what we're trying to do here is there's a two-pronged approach. Number one, we're trying to reform the system, right, to institute some sort of disaster response and recovery system that ensures equal access for assistance that actually helps disaster survivors for everybody impacted by the disaster, and one that builds back our communities in a way that is stronger so they'll be less likely to be impacted or badly impacted by disasters in the future. So we're trying to do that. And then at the same time, we're trying to work to keep each other safe. So because the systems currently in place are not taking care of us and are likely going to even less take care of us in the present administration in the coming months and years, it's important for us to just talk about how we can work to keep each other safe, especially during disasters, especially amid increasing climate change impacts and the increasing frequency and intensity of disasters. So I'll take the next slide. So I'll say for working to keep each other safe. And so a lot of you are involved in organizing work in your own communities, in your own buildings, in your own neighborhoods. Uh, and I think that, you know, I always say that an organized building or an organized neighborhood is one that is less likely to be horribly impacted by disasters because folks know each other, they know each other's needs, they're already working to support each other. And doing that is one of the best ways to kind of make sure that no needs of people within our communities are getting left behind after a disaster. And so, since we're already doing a lot of this work, around high rents, around not having enough apartments around, and around not having accessible housing around. Since we're already doing that, we can kind of integrate in different aspects of disaster preparedness into our work as we go. And I think a lot of folks in Houston I've seen this a lot with like the creation of resilience hubs where it's a shed out in the backyard of somebody's house with a bunch of batteries and flashlights and tools and things within it. There's evacuation planning for your building. Kind of when you're talking to management or you're talking to your developer and pushing for something, you can also ask about what the evacuation plan is in case there is a disaster and what the kind of planning is there for that. You can make sure that you have go bags and emergency supplies for folks in your building. Um, typically you should have go bags kind of in your own apartment for stuff, but sometimes, go bags are super expensive. You're supposed to have a lot of water and food in there. So in some places they'll just have like a collective go bag for the floor or something like that to help people kind of split the cost of all of those things. This could also just be like knowing where to get emergency alerts from your local government or your local fire department, so you know where to go and can have the best information to share with your neighbors. And it's also working for disaster resilience for our buildings, and that can be as simple as like, hey, plant some trees in the parking lot. We want some trees in the parking lot. We want one of those parking lots that has like moss in the middle of it or something like that. All of those things lessen the impact of extreme heat on buildings, as well as the impact of flooding on different types of buildings as well. I'll say I'm working on it's not ready yet, but I am working on a disaster guide specifically geared towards tenants that's talking about a number of different things from like a disaster's impact on your housing subsidy. Like what might you expect if you're on a housing choice voucher, if you have a housing choice voucher and a disaster impacts you, or what radio to get in terms of getting emergency alerts and things like that. So uh, definitely kind of working through this right now for us. So having a space like this is also super important, to working to figuring stuff out like that. So if you have something that you really, desperately would like to see in a disaster tenant guide, please do let me and Megan know. We'll make sure to add it. Um, so that's kind of like, again, working to keep each other safe as we go. I'll take the next slide. Now, the second prong here is reforming the system, right? So in addition to keeping each other safe, once we're kind of like, okay, then we can get about doing systemic change for the system here. And so we have two bills that we're currently working on, and I'll give a kind of a briefer overview of these as we go to make sure that there's time for some questions. And I'll take the next slide. Yeah, so this is a lot of text, and I apologize. I wrote this when I had a really high fever, and it seemed like an appropriate amount of text, but it's not. It's too wordy. Suffice to say, uh, the Fixing Emergency Management for Americans Act, or FEMA, the FEMA Act, is a bill that would remove FEMA from the Department of Homeland Security and establish it as an independent agency. So right away, that would make it easier for FEMA to get out from under the thumb of Department of Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem and the requirements that, she has to sign off on every expenditure over $100,000 or something like that. Things that really slow down when the agency's trying to get out the door to help people. In addition, the separating FEMA from the Department of Homeland Security would also separate a lot of the data sharing that goes on between FEMA and organizations like ICE or the Department of Homeland Security and other sub agencies of the Department of Homeland Security. So I don't know about you, but I would like the people that are trying to help me in disasters to be as far away from, immigration and customs enforcement as humanly possible. Um, so we got that. And then in addition, in this bill, there's also some changes that would make it easier for, folks without a fixed address to get FEMA assistance. So that's like folks that might be applying for assistance because they're, and are living at a shelter. It also increases the duration of FEMA assistance. So from like 18 months to 24 months after a disaster. It creates a unified disaster application. So it kind of cuts down on the amount of paperwork that disaster survivors have to fill out in order to get the assistance that they're eligible for. And it also removes penalties for disaster survivors who are like, using GoFundMe sites and things like that after disasters. That's been a recent thing where FEMA's like, oh, if you word your GoFundMe site wrong, we might have to claw back some of the money that we gave you for disaster assistance. Um, and basically, FEMA as an independent agency will be a lot easier to push around to get the type of assistance programs that we want. and I think will lead to perhaps some better folks joining FEMA that are perhaps more interested in helping people, you know? So we have this bill. I'll take the next slide. So this was introduced in the House of Representatives in the U.S. Congress. So it passed the committee and is currently sitting on the House floor. So we're asking for folks to call or email or message their representatives requesting that they co-sponsor this bill. It's bipartisan. It's 12 Republicans, 7 Democrats. Um, it passed 57-3. But Congress is Congress, so things can take a while, and things that are very important can be on the back burner for years. So really just trying to increase the visibility of this bill and just let policymakers know that this is an important thing for us, especially with the future impacts of climate change, is making sure that we have a independent FEMA that can get assistance to the folks that need it the most. So you got that, and then I will take the next slide. So that's FEMA. Uh, and then as Megan mentioned, kind of towards the top of this, there's also HUD assistance, right? It's this long-term disaster recovery program. It's called CDBG-DR, which if you could say 5 times fast, they let you be a disaster recovery reform advocate. The first week here, I just kept saying CDBG-DR. I was like sitting on the train just going CDBG-DR until I could get it. So that program doesn't actually exist, right? So it has to wait until Congress passes money under the program to get it out the door, for the agency to get it out the door. This bill, it's the Reforming Disaster Recovery Act, would permanently authorize the program. So it's like, hey, there is a CDBG-DR program, and then in addition, it creates a specific account where money can be put there, in advance for future disasters. And so that money can get out the door to disaster impacted areas quicker than waiting for Congress to get off their butts and pass a long-term disaster recovery funds. So it also creates permanent rules for the program, which makes it easier for folks at the state and local governments to plan for how they're going to use these funds. It also balances out things between rebuilding infrastructure and housing. So again, these HUD funds are like pretty flexible, right? Which is generally pretty good, but sometimes when there's a lot of need, uh, a state or local government might be like, well, I actually want to rebuild the road instead of making sure, that we have enough apartments, available for folks that were displaced or something like that. So this bill would require that the funds are at least balanced between those two things. It improves data sharing between all of these groups. So us, at NLIHC and you at home can kind of look at the data and be like, where is this money going? Who's getting it? Are there any inequitable patterns getting formed? And it also creates minimum construction requirements for, buildings that are built with these funds. So making sure that they're strong enough to withstand future disasters. So, and it has a bunch of other stuff too. That's very nerdy, and I don't have, you guys don't need to know about it. But suffice to say, uh, a lot of great things in this bill. And then I will take the next slide. So this bill is part of the Road to Housing Act that just got through the Senate Banking Committee last month. That was like the first piece of significant housing legislation passed by that committee in over a decade, if you can believe it. So the bill has bipartisan support. It's part of this housing package. We're pushing for this housing package to get to the floor on the Senate. Um, we're not sure when it's going to move, but it is a bipartisan priority. So again, we're asking folks to reach out to members of Congress and ask them to support the Road to Housing Act that has the Reforming Disaster Recovery Act in it. And so, yeah, we're pushing for folks to let their members of Congress know about that bill and kind of move that forward. So. I will get the next slide if that's cool. I think I paused here to see if there were any questions. I think Meghan is doing an admirable job of
Yeah, I think we're good, Noah, to keep going.
nailing it. So I will take the next slide then after that. Yeah, this is a good, I'll say, kind of nearing the end of me and Meghan talking here. Is a really good poem by Silas House, who's the poet laureate of Kentucky for a while. Um, it always chokes me up anytime I watch it. But I think it's important that, when we're looking, I think a lot of folks are like, oh, well, I live in blank place. Blank place does not have a lot of disasters. So why do I need to be involved in disasters? Why do I need to be thinking about that? That's not my problem. But I think, instead of thinking about it like, oh, I'm in a place where there's not a lot of disasters, think about it more like I'm on the high ground. I'm on the hill above the places where there are disasters. And when, you're up on the high ground, typically, um, you know, we have a responsibility to help folks that are not on the high ground. So, um, I think learning about disasters, keeping an eye towards what's happening in the policy space or like what I could be doing at my house to kind of increase, uh, how improve how me and my neighbors could survive a disaster or keeping an eye on all these things. It's very important, uh, just for all of us to kind of work together on this. So I think it's super important there. And I'll take the next slide. And so in addition, um, we have a bunch of different materials available here on the Disaster Housing Recovery Coalition at the Disaster Housing Recovery Coalition. We did just put out, I think this spring, a toolkit on disaster organizing strategies. So that's kind of taking kind of your common um, housing related organizing strategies that we all know and love and kind of applying that to a disaster context and talking about like how to talk with the media, like how to, why coalitions are great for disaster recovery work and like that sort of a thing. So that's always an excellent resource, and I encourage folks to take a look at it. In addition, we always host our flagship Disaster Housing Recovery Coalition working group every other Wednesday at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. So you're always more than welcome to join us there. That is a good place where if you're working on an issue or you're impacted by a disaster and you don't know what's going on, but you've heard something, that's a good place I say to scream a question into the void and have the void scream an answer back at you. So. And then finally, we have a bunch of policy priorities and advocacy material and more at the DHR section of NLIHC's website. So we're always doing a bunch of stuff. Again, as I said, we're working on a tenant's disaster guide, just to make sure that, you know, y'all are able to kind of get the information that you need uh, in the aftermath of a disaster. It's going to be like a series of one pagers. So it's kind of just like print out the ones you need and throw it on the fridge, that type of a thing. Um, but yeah, I will stop rambling there. And, as always, you can reach out to me and Meghan. Um, my email is there, and I'm sure Meghan can throw her email in the chat as well.
All righty. Can we take a second and give a round of applause to Noah and Meghan for joining us today? Um, I'm, I'm pretty sure that this has been meaningful information that has been shared that you could take back to your communities and to your colleagues. So thank you all for being here with us today. It's been an honor to learn, grow, and uh, build community alongside each and one of you. As a reminder, you'll be able to assess the full recording, today's presentation, and all previous Training Institute webinars directly on our Training Institute webpage where you registered. If you missed a session or want to revisit one, everything will be uploaded soon, so please check the site often. And we're excited to share that more webinars are coming as part of the second trimester of the Training Institute. Each session will continue building your power as tenant leaders, from organizing and disaster recovery to advocacy, communications, and beyond. So stay plugged in and invite others to join this growing movement. As we close, remember, these aren't just webinars. This is a training for transformation. You are the future of the movement. Your voice, your leadership, and your story matter. I'll leave you with this quote by Margaret. Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. Until next time, keep organizing, keep growing, and keep believing. Thank you again. We'll see you all on the next session. Take care, everyone.